Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Thomas Balch Library, and we are so excited to have you join us today for a virtual presentation from Mark Treanor on his novel, A Quiet Cadence. Just a few housekeeping tips. If you have any questions, please put them either in the Q&A box or the chat, and we will definitely get to those at the end of this presentation. If you have any technical issues throughout, I'm going to put the email address in the chat box. It's balchlib@leesburgva.gov, and we will be glad to help you. Otherwise, I'm going to hand it over to Mark for his presentation.
Thanks, Nora. I appreciate that. And thanks to the Thomas Balch Library and to you and to Alexander Gressett and Laura Schneider for putting this together. I really appreciate the opportunity, and thanks to the folks that are listening today or watching today, I guess. I thought what I'd do is just give a little bit of background on myself as it relates to the book that I wrote, and then talk a tiny bit about the factors that led up to me writing it, and hopefully that will give folks some context for the readings that I'm going to do. And then I'll read several relatively short excerpts out of the book, and then very happily answer any questions or engage in any discussion that folks might want to at the end of that. So I graduated from the United States Naval Academy in 1968 and accepted a commission in the Marine Corps. About 10% of each class was allowed to volunteer to go into the Marines at that time. So I was one of the guys that did that, and went off to training and then went to Vietnam in January of '69 and came back in January of '70. I was a rifle platoon leader and infantry leader in Vietnam. And then when I came back, I switched from infantry to artillery, and I went down to Camp Lejeune to North Carolina, where I commanded an artillery battery. And then I was the aide to the general down there, and then moved to Quantico a couple years after that, and finished up my last couple of years in the Marines before I left and went to law school as an instructor in leadership, weapons, and tactics at the basic school. When I came home, as you can tell from what I just described, I kind of came back to the wide open arms of the Marine Corps. I still had another 3.5 years of an active service that I was going to spend, at least. And so I didn't, I wasn't thrust right into the middle of civilian society like a lot of guys were when they came home. But if you fast forward to the late '70s, early '80s, while I had experienced a few things, a few very minor incidents, literally had a couple of girls give me the finger in the airport in Chicago as I was flying home in uniform from Vietnam. It's funny today, it wasn't quite as funny then. But I was surrounded by Marines. Everybody was a Vietnam veteran or was going to Vietnam. And so while I knew what was going on outside, I didn't have a deep personal familiarity with it. But then fast forward to the '80s, and the Reagan administration put together a program called the Vietnam Veterans Leadership Program. And it was all volunteers that were guys that had gone on to some success in life, had pretty good started their careers and all. And it was an attempt to get some of us in positions like that to help Vietnam veterans who had not had the same luck and same success that we did. And I got to be the chairman of the first chapter of that in Maryland, and then did more on a national basis with it. And that gave me some real insights into what a lot of people had experienced that had been very traumatic for them post-Vietnam. And so I worked with that. It was all volunteers. I was still working as a lawyer at the time, but I came into quite a number of people that influenced me and my way of thinking about what had really happened to the young men and some women, of course, but not all that many back in those days. Went to Vietnam and certainly weren't directly in combat for the most part. But if you take a look at that period of time in our history, people conflated the war with the warrior. 19-year-old kids don't make policy decisions for darn sure. And so it was a very unfortunate and unfair and frankly, in my view, stupid way to treat the young guys that had come home from fighting in a war. And I got to know a fair amount more about that. Well, again, jump forward a little bit, and I've been interested in writing for some period of time. And so I worked at writing a couple of different novels. All of them had a Vietnam flavor of one sort or another to them. And they never went anywhere. The first one was absolutely atrocious. The second was a little bit better. And the third was pretty decent, but not great. And I think the manuscripts gather mold in my basement now, someplace, if I haven't already used them for fire starters. But around 2013 or 14, I really got the itch to write some more. And I had been interested in writing all along. I'd taken several courses at different places, workshops and things like that. Had gone halfway through a distance learning program at MFA program in creative writing at Vermont College, and I really decided I wanted to take another whack at writing a novel. And I decided that what I really wanted to do was something dealing with a Vietnam veteran. And I was not aware, still am not today, except for Quiet Cadence, of any novel that combines an authentic description of the intensity and trauma, if you will, of ground combat with the aftermath and the impact that it has on the young men that we send off to be infantrymen in war and what they bring home in their heads and their hearts later on. And I decided I wanted to try and write that book. So 3 years and 9 drafts later, A Quiet Cadence got accepted by the Naval Institute Press, and that's the book I'm going to talk about today, of course. So that was kind of why I wrote the book, but added to that was the concept in my own mind that Vietnam veterans had been very badly treated. And that while the veterans of our latest wars have been treated better, my own personal view is that some of that is more of a surface treatment than going down deep. And what I tried to do in the book was say something primarily about what people lived with when they came home. I happen to be a very strong believer that the overwhelming majority of combat veterans certainly experience when they come home some sort of PTS, post-traumatic stress. But I leave the D off it for the overwhelming majority of us. I don't believe it rises to the level of a disorder. Guys come home, they get on with life, they get married, they have families, and guys, and now today, of course, women, they have families, they're productive citizens, they lead decent lives. I don't believe for a minute that there aren't a lot of folks out there that have been through the trauma of combat that are having a tough time wrestling with it, even decades afterwards. But for the overwhelming majority, that's not true. And for Vietnam veterans, for example, 97% of Vietnam veterans received honorable discharges. 2.1 million served in the war, 58,000 were killed, another 5,000 or 6,000 had traumatic amputations. And yet they came home, and 90% of Vietnam veterans in surveys that were done in the 80s and 90s said that they were very proud of their service. But you didn't read that in the popular press. And so A Quiet Cadence was my way of attempting to show at the front end the horrors and traumas of ground combat, but then in the second half of the book to depict a character who came home, had to wrestle with the ghosts that were inside his head, had to wrestle with his doubts about the value of what he had done, and a lot of other things, and but still got on with life as a good man as he went forward. So with that as kind of background and explanation of what I was attempting to accomplish in the book, I thought that I'd go ahead and read 4 or 5 or so relatively short excerpts, a couple longer than others, to give you a sense for what I was trying to accomplish there, and you'll be able to judge for yourselves whether I came close or not. I'll start off reading the entire first chapter, which is only 2.5 pages, because it really sets out what I was attempting to do in the book, and what the story is really about. Sometimes the ghosts talk to me still. 40 years ago, they came frequently. In my 30s and 40s and 50s, not very much. They visited some in recent years, and mostly that's okay. The dream frightened me for a long time. I couldn't tell if my old friends accused me or wished me well. Sometimes they seemed to look to me for answers I've never had. I searched for a long time for a way to make peace with them and what I'd lost. My best friend and my wife helped me with that. Corey lost a great deal more than I did in Vietnam, at least physically, yet helped me remember what was good. Patty lived with much of what I brought home and saved me more than once from the dark. I've spoken very little of my war and the turmoil that followed, and over the years, nearly no one has asked. Most men my age celebrate Woodstock and Haight-Ashbury, reminisce about sit-ins on campuses or protests in the streets. They still marvel at their luck in the draft, or depending on their audience, boast of or bury the deferments they received. My decile of the 60s generation grows old, having said little to our children about times very different for us. Recently, though, even us old guys sometimes hear, "Thanks for your service," sort of faint echoes of the well-deserved cheers greeting our troops coming home from our most recent wars. My guess is they'll find it difficult, too, to grapple with the truths they've learned. We have more in common than they may know. I'd like my kids to understand the events that changed their old man forever when I wasn't much older than theirs are now. Sometimes I think they believe the memories of those charged days were surgically removed along with the bullet in my back. Not that I blame them. I haven't exactly encouraged questions about my war or its impact on me, but I remember it all, a gift and a curse. Sometimes remembrance across decades is like looking through a telescope. People and events in the distance come into the sharpest focus of all. The pictures come to me in extraordinary detail, like photos my brain took but couldn't erase, sometimes frayed at the edges with photos I would not want to lose. I remember the odors, the heat and the wet, the exhaustion and fear. I can still taste the bite of gunpowder, the terrible ferric sweetness of blood. I can still hear the cacophonous noises, the voices, the argot, the silences. It's as though they're next to my ear. What a profane, crass gang we were. I remember the pain and the joy when I returned to the world, the hopes and the nightmares, the shame of what I did to get my first job. It's the one I'll retire from soon. I remember the love. My family and friends know me as a man whose most violent moments generated fast tennis serves. How do I explain that when I was very young, I plumbed the depths of depravity without knowing if I'd find my way back to sanity's surface? I can describe the camaraderie of shared misery, but can I also relate the excitement, the pride, and love without downplaying the horror and terror that nearly drove me mad? What about the craziness in the years after the war? Patty thinks it's important that I tell the truth. She knows little of my story, but she's probably right. She's usually been. I think it's time I tried. I know that too many men grow old basking in selected memories of their youth. But I don't believe much in glory, though I wouldn't trade anything for my time in the Corps, unless it was to save the forever young men who march front and center in my sleep. That dream always begins in silence, an absolute vacuum of noise, then only a faint, distant sound, the whup-whup and thrum of an approaching medevac bird. Quivering in the air, a muted tremor of cries. A shroud of gunpowder-infused fog covers all. Then my old friends emerge from the swirling pall and walk toward me, their eyes never leaving my face. They step to a cadence I sometimes strain to hear. Lately, Pious John's spoken for all 6 of them. Tell them now, Mick, he says. Tell them the truth. This, then, is their story and mine. It begins on the day I saw the dead man above the trees. And then jumping forward, this is a description of Marty, who is the speaker in the book, the protagonist of the book, a description of his first firefight. The lieutenant brought the platoon online so we could bring all our firepower to bear to the front. We couldn't move fast in the muck, so we walked spread out in the open for what felt like a long time. Loud, sharp, cackling bursts of gunfire suddenly spewed from the tree line. Things happened so fast they seemed to meld into one turbulent blur of noise and frenetic action and confusion. Though later everything that happened next was embedded in my brain with stop frame, slow motion clarity. The cacophony of gunfire was bedlam. M16s, M60s, AK-47s, a Gook machine gun. I had no clue what targets anyone in the platoon was firing at. All I could see of the tree line beyond that dike I so desperately wanted to get down behind was dense foliage shivering and crackling and thin wisps of smoke rising like gossamer ghosts in the thick green. I was 10 yards from the dike when a line of tracers from an NVA machine gun ripped past my head. Neon blue-green flashes like bright blobs of protoplasm at ear level, 5 or 6 inches from my face. I had the strongest, craziest sensation that I could just lift my hand, wave high to John, and the bullets would pass through my palm like a Saturday morning cartoon character trying to catch blurbs of brightly colored light. In that split second of caricature clarity, it barely registered that dozens of bullets had just passed within inches of my face. We half knelt, half lay, bullets snapping above our heads. John raked the trees with a long, yammering blast. I lifted the belts up out of the can, let the rounds run across my palm, run smoothly down into the feed tray, an inch below my hand. Burst after burst, tracers slashed streaking red fire from us into the tree line. Then the lieutenant was yelling for anyone without a real target to cease fire, and the platoon sergeant and then the squad leaders took up the call, and John stopped firing, and then Geo, and up and down the dike the firing became only sporadic. Lieutenant Mangan took first squad down the dike to a stand of trees on the left. With a pop and a whoosh, a green cluster flare tore into the air. We blasted the tree line in front of the enveloping squad as the lieutenant and the Marines with him swept in from the left. Then John stopped shooting. There were 3 or 4 bursts of M16 fire inside the tree line, then all firing stopped, and then there was a strange momentary silence as though I'd gone suddenly deaf. 2 bodies lay sprawled just inside the tree line, 2 more back in the trees. I joined Harding and Woody and looked down at the corpses. One had part of his face shot away, smashed teeth and jawbone and broken leaking nose and sinus cavities, one eye bulging out as though ready to explode from its socket and blast through the air like a ghoul's golf ball. My stomach churned. Smitty's prediction that I'd grow to like looking at dead gooks wasn't yet accurate. And then the next section deals with Marty's first experience with somebody tripping a booby trap. We call them IEDs today, but they were rampant in major parts of Vietnam. They certainly were in the area that is the setting for this book. The earth belched a sharp, roaring blast that evaporated every other noise and filled the air with filthy smoke and debris. Booby trap Corrigan Tripp blew off his foot and ripped the meat from above his severed ankle to 10 inches below his knee. When the acrid gray smoke cleared, I saw him writhing on his back near the front of our column. The bones in his legs stuck out like the bloody tines of a crushed tuning fork. He held his mangled stump up in the air with one hand, clutched at the dirt with the other, as if he was struggling to keep from being torn away again from the earth. He began to scream, his shrieks climbing a hideous scale, breaking at the top, followed by a moaning gulp for air, then beginning again. They felt like molten tin rushing through my ears, filling my sinuses, making my teeth and cheekbones throb. I wanted to cover my ears, but couldn't in front of the others. I squeezed my eyes shut so hard my sockets throbbed. My chest and stomach felt burned inside. The two corpsmen tied off Corey's leg. They knelt beside him, knees dark with his blood, bloody hands moving fast with tourniquet and bandages, checked his femoral arteries, his torso, his head and neck for other wounds. Harding cradled Corey's head in his lap, and Sergeant Gillis tried to hold him steady while Matt hit him with morphine and ran an IV into his arm. The two docs said little as they worked. They'd performed that choreography together too many times. It seemed to take a long time before the morphine quelled Corey's screams. He lay motionless, his eyes partly open and a dull gawk, his normally taut face flaccid and deflated. The tip of his tongue inched out as though seeking comfort from his dirty straw mustache. Below his trousers, his pallid leg ended in blood-soaked bandages lying in coagulated maroon dirt. Even after the helicopter took him away, I could see Corey's truncated leg and tortured face, smell the blood and burned meat. For the rest of that day and into that night, his screams seemed to linger in the air. When I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out their noise, I saw bloody, jagged bones like snapped-off pipe stems slathered with gore. The echo of that day stayed with me, perhaps because that's when I began my descent toward a depth of depravity that appalls me now, though one that seemed common, nearly unremarkable, nearly necessary in that violent world. The rest of the first half of the book continues kind of along that same vein. There's a lot more to it, of course, but dealing with Marty's experiences in Vietnam. And then he's wounded and he comes home. And his readjustment problems start very soon after he gets home in small ways. His relatives throw him a coming home party, and this is a bit of a description of what happens there. Most of what people had to say the rest of the evening was just pleasant small talk. The latest movies, favorite comedies on TV, a good book, the O's and the Colts, stuff of no consequence at all. But several times the conversation turned to things that appalled me. Aunt Mary so aggravated by a broken appliance, how angry Uncle Gene had gotten at the poor service at the Chevy dealer, how upset Aunt Dolores was by the inability of the cleaner to get a stain out of her favorite dress. What the fuck is wrong with you people, I said to myself. Do you have the slightest goddamn idea what's really important? If you knew about Pious John or Geo or Woody or Corrigan or Mike and Dottie Jackson or any of thousands of other guys, you'd be ashamed of your pissant concerns. I wanted to shake people, yell at them, make them understand, but I hid my anger instead. The party was for me, after all, and these were my aunts and uncles. I was supposed to be grateful, and in some ways I was. Still, I found myself drawing inward, talking less as the evening went on. I was more than ready when Mom thought my silence was due to the pain in my chest and suggested we leave. Marty goes through rehab and then he goes down to Camp Lejeune. And while he's there, he talks about some of the dreams he'd been having. My dreams came in all shapes and sizes in relations to truth. Most times I couldn't point to any given event that triggered a nightmare, but it wasn't hard to figure out where they'd come from. Except for the ghost dream, though, the friends I'd lost rarely appeared in any of them. Maybe that was because they were so often in my thoughts during the day. The dream I had for months seemed to be a metaphor for all the gruesome pictures I carried in my head. A large, murky picture, a muted still life like a faded Renoir. A helmet, camouflage covered, soiled and faded by months in the bush. 4 bullet holes in a line from the crown to where the left ear would be. The terrible sharp whap of bullets hitting metal. A short distance away, a pile of damp matter resembling hamburger gone bad. Mottled grays streaked red throughout, vapors rising from the small heap. When I could finally force myself to turn away from the picture, I'd come awake drenched in sweat, a bitter metallic taste on my sore tongue. Why I'd lived when my friends had died haunted my dreams as well as waking thoughts. Sometimes I dreamt of row upon row of body bags, like a black plastic version of the markers in Arlington. Some bags were packed full, others only in part. Some appeared to contain almost nothing at all. A solitary man in jungle utilities walked slowly as though examining them. He stopped, looked down, an empty body bag at his feet. The man was me. Marty goes on and he goes to college. He wants to be a teacher. And yet, like a lot of Vietnam veterans in those days, he's having a lot of trouble finding a job. And one of his professors gives him the name of the head of the English department at a private school where Marty would really like to teach. But the professor asks him if he's got his Marine Corps service on his resume. And Marty says, of course he does. And the professor tells him he has to take it off if he wants to get a job there. And that really is something that Marty has to wrestle with. As he thinks about it, this is what happens. I must have sat staring at the professor for some time. I knew there were a lot of guys who didn't like vets. It seemed to me that any time a guy did something wrong, if he was a vet, that was in the news article's first line. Marine Corps veteran robs store, or Army vet swipes guardrail. I'd never seen man with 4 draft deferments convicted of drunk driving, or a former war protester embezzles from bank. It pissed me off, but it never occurred to me that being a Marine could keep me from getting a job. Marty does get a job, and he goes on. He's becomes a dad, good husband, and he literally runs into Corrigan, the guy who lost his leg in one of the earlier chapters. And despite the fact that he's an amputee, Corey and Marty run together every Sunday morning. Corrigan has a very different attitude from Marty's. Marty's trying to forget everything about the war and about his friends, who were crippled or killed. Corrigan is very enthused about the Vietnam Veterans Memorial that's being built in Washington. And he's trying to talk Marty into going with him to the dedication of it and going to the National Salute to Vietnam Veterans. And one morning, they've talked about this over various periods of time, but one morning after they've run together, Marty tells Corey he's not going to go. And then he says, Corey wouldn't give up. Even if you don't care about the parade, you can bet with all the guys there, it's going to be party time. Corey was pushing me too damn hard. How the hell could anyone party after looking at 58,000 names on that wall? I drained my beer, didn't say anything about the supposed party. We'll give it some thought, Corey said. You might change your mind. Even if you don't think so now, you're going to want to see the wall. That's going to be wonderful. Wonderful. 58,000 names of men who died for nothing right in front of my face? My God, I lost it then. I don't want to think about it, goddammit. I jumped down off the tailgate, accidentally knocking Corrigan's leg to the ground. I picked it up, slapped the Nike and the plastic foot to get the dirt off. Jesus Christ, Corey, I don't need to see it. My fingernails clawed at the dirt in the folds of the cup at the top of the plastic calf. I didn't mean to sound so harsh to my friend, but it was just too damn much. Corey, I said, and slapped the plastic-filled running shoe again hard. It's the last place in the entire goddamn world I want to be. I slapped the Nike again, harder, whap, whap. I stopped slapping the shoe as abruptly as I started. Neither one of us spoke for a minute, and then I went on, more quietly, less frantically. For 10 years, we fight a war and guys die every day. We're fighting global communism. We're fighting to keep the people of South Vietnam free. We're fighting for peace, for honor. We're fighting for this. We're fighting for that. We're fighting over the size and shape of the fucking table at the Paris peace talks. And one day the president comes on television and says, I declare the war over. We've achieved peace with honor. Jesus Christ. I looked at the other cars parked near us. No one was around. It wouldn't have made any difference. I barreled on. And then the tanks roll south, and we watch all those people we claimed were our friends claw at the embassy gates, then spend the next 10 years in concentration camps if they weren't shot. Is that all it takes? 58,000 guys in body bags, and then people in pinstripe suits say, "Ah, fuck it, we don't need this war. Let's let them have the goddamn place, and we just call it quits." I pressed my fingertips hard into my throbbing shoulder. Christ, Corey, why wasn't it over before then if it was going to be over at all before anything really got done? Did we have a goddamn quota before Johnson or Nixon or somebody would finally say, okay, that's enough guys in bags. Let's just give up and go home? All those kids killed. My good God. Why couldn't Corey understand? He left his own goddamn leg in the dirt. He'd known those same guys I tried to avoid in my head. Didn't he ache for them just like I did? I took a deep, gasping breath. I looked over at Corey and then in a very quiet voice said, Corey, I'm sorry. I don't mean to yell at you, but what the hell do I need to go to the Vietnam Memorial for? What is there that would change things, that would make the pain worthwhile? During my entire outburst, Corey had just sat staring at the ground, rubbing the red tip of his stump with a big chunk of ice. He stopped rubbing his leg, dropped the ice in the dirt beside the truck, and looked at me. It's the guys, Marty, he said. They did their best and we love them. They're what counts in the end. No matter the outcome of that war, they mattered to us. Corey looked away as though he could see something off in the distance again. He went on quietly. We may each have had different reasons for serving, but at the end of the day, what we fought for was each other. We were part of a brotherhood. We still are, that believed in courage and discipline and loyalty. No matter what we thought or think now of our political leaders or their decisions, we believed in America and each other. That was the cadence we all marched to, Marty. You, me, all the guys with their names on the wall, even the kids who serve now. And something inside us is going to march to that quiet cadence for the rest of our lives. And then the book goes on there, more Marty dealing with his thoughts about the war and with Corrigan and the memorial. So those are the excerpts. And if anybody has questions or anything they'd like to ask or like me to talk about, I'm very happy to do that. Welcome back, Nora.
Thank you so much, Mark. That was great. If anybody has questions, please put them in the Q&A box or the chat. So one of the questions that we have is, how many of Marty's experiences are your own and how much of the book is really fiction?
Well, the book is fiction. It's a novel. None of the characters actually existed or exist today. But particularly in the Vietnam part of the book, a lot of the experiences that I had informed the way I talked about or described or depicted things that Marty and his friends were going through. You know, one kind of today funny, wasn't quite as funny at the time, example that I'd give about that is from the excerpt that I read about Marty's first firefight. My first firefight. Now, I was a lieutenant. I wasn't a PFC like Marty was, so I was a platoon leader. And we got hit one day, and so we were charging forward towards the Rice Paddy Dike and in a fight. And it was my very first time. And literally, I had that experience that Marty had in the book where a line of tracers went within literal inches of my face as they went by me. And, you know, I literally had this just weird sensation. This is strange, you know, God, I could touch those things. And so that informed that story right there. And I thank my lucky stars. I had retroactive fear after that about what had happened, because, you know, if that enemy machine gunner had sneezed or flinched or you know, bounced the end of his machine gun an inch to the right, it would have taken my head off. But, you know, at the very moment, I wasn't thinking about that. So there were things like that, you know, experiences that I had that informed the way I thought about what an enlisted guy like Marty might feel, might experience. Um, I can say that a lot of what is depicted there, while not an actual rendition necessarily of things that I did or that people around me or that people that I knew did, they certainly provided the knowledge that I needed to depict them there. The coming home section and the at home section, um, some of that is related to things that I experienced, but the overwhelming majority of, I guess I'd say, is more. Um, it's really an imagined version of concepts that I had gotten when I was dealing with Vietnam veterans, and a lot of the reading that I had done, and so I tried to imagine it into a story there. That help?
Along the same lines, have any of the men you served with read the novel and contacted you about it?
A couple have, yes. Um, and the reaction that I get is that they're glad somebody told the story. A reaction that I get from a lot of veterans is that there are a number of really excellent war novels out there. But as I was saying at the front end, maybe I succeeded a bit in doing a combination that hadn't been done before, because a lot of the vets that I talked to about the book really appreciate the second half, the at-home part, and it makes them realize that, hey, thoughts that they had, ideas that they had, things that they went through when they came home were not unique to them, that a lot of people went through it. And I've gotten that a lot. I've talked in some veteran centers, and some of those guys have got horrendous stories, but some of the VA centers are using the book as kind of a teaching and healing guide, and not guide, but prop, I guess. And that's a reaction that I get from some of those guys.
You spoke of the brotherhood forged from the Vietnam experience, and is that not a truism for all soldiers in all wars?
I think it really is. You know, it's a good point. I've been really gratified to talk or correspond with any number of veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan, and to a person, it's been fascinating to me because they say, "Hey, Mark, thanks for writing that book. It's really about us." And I've actually gotten to know a couple of these guys very well, and have gotten together with them, uh, and they think that the story is their story, as well as a Vietnam veteran story, both from the combat perspective for the guys that were infantrymen, and from the perspective of how they had to wrestle with their ghosts and their doubts and their ideas after they came home. So
Yeah,
that's
I
the
was
real
gonna
deal.
ask if you had spoken to soldiers returning from Iraq and Afghanistan, and how they had interacted with the book as well. But it seems that, you know, they've found it helpful.
I actually did a book talk a couple of weeks ago by Zoom again, with a book club made up of Iraq and Afghanistan veterans. And, you know, again, they really appreciated particularly the second half of the book. They, like a lot of people, find the first half tough going because it's pretty graphic. I mean, some of the sections are much more graphic than what I read this morning. And the reason that I did that actually was because I was trying to convey to people who weren't veterans what it was that Marty, actually the protagonist, actually experienced, and therefore why he felt the way he did after he got home. And I think people, once they get to the second half of the book, they really appreciate or understand why the first half can really expose the trauma there.
The book's called A Quiet Cadence. This reader seemed to feel that it was more like a firefight. Was the cadence intended to impact the reader, or was that just the reality of life in the bush in Vietnam?
It's a great question. I think that the story, the depiction in the first half, which is probably what that person is talking about, is feeling like a firefight, and it pretty much was as described there. There are certainly side stories in there, but there's quite a bit of combat experience depicted in that first half. But it sets up the second half, and I think, yes, to answer at least part of that question, I did want the first half to impact the reader, not so much just to horrify them with what we ask our, it's what we ask our 19 and 20-year-old kids to do. The guys that fought in Sangin province or Sangin district in Helmand province in Afghanistan went through very, very similar stuff. And, we keep sending our 19, 20-year-old young people off to experience this. And so what I was trying to do was help the reader to really understand what it was like for a young guy, to live in the dirt day after day, under just miserable physical conditions, and then go out every day where people are trying to kill him, and he's watching friends get killed and maimed, and he's trying to kill the guys on the other side. And so I was trying to do an authentic depiction of what I think that was really like, and again, trying to be a little bit more universal by making it the story from an enlisted man's point of view.
So this is a comment and question that came in. Your book is as powerful as those of Karl Marlantes, and it strikes me that there have been a couple, perhaps several iterations of Vietnam novels. Those that came out soon after the war, 5 years or so, then later ones, and then now in the past 10 years, another series, and the latter with more reflection and that are more powerful and lasting. Is there another novel in the works for you, or have you considered reworking those earlier ones you mentioned? And, will you continue with the theme of Vietnam, or are you looking at something else?
I am not going to rework the ones that are covered with mold in the basement unless working them is considered using them in the fireplace. But I am beginning to work. I'm in the very, very early stages on next novel. It's a little hard to tell exactly where it's going, but it will deal with our more current wars, particularly Afghanistan, and will deal more with the home front in that respect. To the original part of that question or comment about Karl Marlantes' book came out in 2010, like the reader was talking about there. I don't know that the books that have come out later are better than the earlier ones. I think they do bring a different perspective. And they may be told with more introspection because we've all got the distance. It's been 50 years since the war. And I think those that are told from the viewpoint of somebody looking back on it over a longer period of time are in fact different. I think that the protagonist, Marty, in A Quiet Cadence, he's a 65-year-old guy looking at something that happened to him 40 years earlier, almost 40 years earlier. More than that, I guess. He was 19 at the time. But so I think that, there are any number of good stories out there, but I would agree that there's probably a distance in perspective that comes from putting distance and time between the writing and the doing it.
Did you find, you wrote those earlier novels and then A Quiet Cadence. Did you find that it became easier to write as there was more distance for you, easier to kind of approach some of the themes that you had to work with in A Quiet Cadence as you got more distant from the actual events?
I'll answer that in a couple of different ways, Nora. I think, I probably sort of wrung out some of the tougher feelings and experiences I had that I had relied on heavily in the first couple of books. And so when I dealt with some of the very tough Vietnam sections in A Quiet Cadence, I didn't find it traumatic for the most part to write those. There were a couple that caught in my throat, but what I found was that probably because I'm a father and a grandfather, that the at-home part, particularly where it dealt with parents and Marty's thoughts about parents, that took a lot of energy to write. And I think it's because in more recent years, I don't think let me backtrack. I don't think when I was 22 and a second lieutenant in Vietnam leading a platoon, I don't think I really appreciated the impact that had on my mother to have her oldest son in combat and know that he was in combat. And I think that there were a couple of times when I didn't have enough common sense to not tell her what was happening. I probably described a couple of things to her that I shouldn't have. And I think about that more. And so in the second part of the book, I found that took a lot of real effort to write those books. There's a scene there, one in particular, a chapter that deals in particular with a set of parents, and that one took a lot of work.
Have you found that men and women have dissimilar reactions to war or different types of ways of expressing their experiences through, the books that you've read or the people you've spoken to?
That's interesting. I'm not sure. I have talked to a couple of women about the book who were in combat in Iraq, for example, and Afghanistan. And their experience, they find the book very interesting because their experience is different from what the guys that are out in the infantry units really go through. Some of their experience can be very difficult and very traumatic and very, very dangerous for sure. But it probably doesn't bring with it the same day-to-day intensity that being part of a rifle squad or rifle platoon does. And so we've talked about that, and I think they've appreciated that depiction. The women that I've talked to about the book that I have found particularly enlightening for me to have discussions with are sisters of Vietnam vets or even current vets, or mothers of current veterans, or daughters of Vietnam veterans. And when they've read the book, they've all said, not all of them, but the overwhelming majority of them have said, this is the first time that I've really understood what my father, brother, son, etc. actually experienced and why he doesn't talk about it. So thanks for writing a book that gives us something that some understanding of what they talk about or what they don't talk about.
Well, that looks like all the questions.
Okay.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Mark, and thank you everyone for joining in today. It's been a great afternoon, and if you haven't had a chance to get your copy of A Quiet Cadence, please make sure you do. And again, thank you so much for joining us, Mark. We really enjoyed it.
Thanks, Nora. I really appreciate the opportunity, and thanks to everybody that was watching or listening in today.
And thank you so much for joining us, and have a great rest of your afternoon, everyone.
Thanks.